Everybody, it's Ilan from the Egard podcast. Another amazing guest today, Brother Gregory, who is an author. He works at His Holy Church. He's got, do you have your own podcast as well? I
Yes,
believe?
Keys of the Kingdom
Keys of the
podcast, and
Kingdom.
usually have, because a lot of people use that, it's Keys of the Kingdom with Brother Gregory. You can find it most places. There's thousands of audios up at this
And
time.
a natural shepherd.
Yeah, and a real live shepherd out on the high deserts of Oregon.
How long have you been doing that for?
Well, almost 50 years.
Wow.
We came out here years ago. It was funny, when I was 7 years old, my dad asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, and I had no idea at 7, and my answer was a shepherd, and I have no idea where that came from. He was hoping me to say lawyer or something, because he was a lawyer.
So you made the decision at 7 and stuck with it.
Well, I said it. I don't even remember making the decision. I didn't even know a shepherd. I didn't ever see a sheep at that point in my life. But I was a boy from Texas, and but I actually went in to study to be a priest for a number of years, early, when I was about 13, St. Joseph's College. But I eventually ended up out on the desert herding sheep, and that's a long story. The older you get, the longer the story gets.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So was faith always a part of your life, or was it something that you found later? Like, obviously by 13 you were already...
It was extremely a part of my life, and my faith was in kind of a still small voice in my, I would literally, my kids would talk about this, that they would ask me a question and I would turn to the side looking for the answer and come up with an answer. And, what I was doing was listening to what, in my opinion, I didn't think this out at 7, but I was listening to what does my heart tell me? What does God tell me? And hopefully God is in my heart. And I think we can do a lot of things so that we can't hear God anymore. It's not that he's not trying to guide us, but we're just not listening. And so I think that's a key element in my faith, is over the years, a lot of them, I've learned to listen a little bit more, and I've learned the mistake of not listening. And so that, faith, my faith is never really come into question. I didn't get disillusioned with the church and run off and become an atheist or anything. I just following that inner guidance, inner voice.
Well, you're blessed to have that. I think a lot of us do, self-admittedly, on and off a lot of my life. I struggled, then I find it, then I struggle. You know what I mean? There's like in and outs. It's, it's a journey for me. So I always love hearing that there's some people who have it from day one.
Oh, I'm not going to say I never stumbled or never got, I could get upset with the best of them, I suppose, or angry. But the more you step back, and we teach a form of meditation that's an ancient Hebrew form of meditation. You see it in the early Christian communities. But it's just waiting upon the Lord, being still. What Elijah said, and others, to be still and know. And so, but it's an individual journey. And, we all, the more you forgive others, the easier it is to forgive yourself, and vice versa.
Yeah, that's an incredibly powerful quote.
Yeah.
The more you hold on to that, the more it destroys you when you have a problem with someone. So
yeah, we're not supposed to judge others or ourselves. But judging doesn't mean you don't see that somebody's doing wrong. Like I don't judge my kids, but if I saw them when they were small about to do something that's going to get them into trouble, I'm going to speak up. As a matter of fact, I think that's a big problem in today's world, is people were afraid to speak up about things they knew deep down are wrong.
Well, yeah, that's the whole kind of motto here.
Yeah, that's why I'm saying it in the way. Because I've seen you learn to do that. And I remember you interviewed or were in an interview with Anomaly at one time. I haven't seen it in a long time, but I've watched Anomaly when he first started doing this stuff, and you see him progressing,
Yeah.
Even Jordan Peterson started out a socialist.
Yeah. I interviewed Jordan Peterson. I'll tell you the thing that both of us kind of connected over was, uh, and I think it's a realization that a lot of people have faith come to, is that if you are going to accept the idea that there's some things that are just universally good and some things that are universally bad, right? That built
Yeah,
into the fabric of the universe, you have to
absolutely.
ask the question, why? So if you're going to tell me that some things are just absolutely bad, I don't care who does it, I don't care what time in history it's happening, that is a wrong action, that there's some kind of universal ethic. And you have to say there is something greater than the material that allows for a universal ethic. Otherwise, everything is morally relative.
You're right.
Uh, and
Absolutely.
that's the real saving grace of faith, because without it, reality falls apart.
But unfortunately, a lot of people mistake ideology for faith.
Hmm.
And one of the reasons they do this, which is a common thing that we talk about and I write about, is that people read the metaphors in the Old Testament, the allegories in the Old Testament, or even in the New Testament. Jesus' parables are allegories, they're stories. And they unmoor the story and the symbols of the story from the meaning, or unmoor the meaning from the story. And then they chase the story, they chase the words, they chase the symbols. And then so people want to say that, I'm a Greek, or I'm a Roman, or I'm a Jew, or I'm a Catholic, or a Christian, or whatever. But they've unmoored the meaning of those terms from what they originally were. I mean, Rome was originally a republic, but by the time Jesus Christ comes along, it has degenerated into an imperial dictatorship.
Hmm.
And yet, many of the characteristics of the Roman sense of law and justice and character were still alive, which is why many of the Roman soldiers became Christians. Somebody was saying that Christianity spread amongst the poor. No, it did spread amongst the poor, but Christianity spread amongst everybody who was willing to hear what Christ was really talking about. But then we begin to identify with this religion or this denomination. We're non denominational in the sense that we see one denominator of Christianity, which is Christ. And
Hmm.
then I spent a lifetime showing people that Christ, Moses, and Abraham were saying the same thing, those universal principles that they
Well,
were talking
I'd love to hear more about that. Do you mind jumping into, because when we first started off camera, you had said that the connection between all of them was
Yeah,
something that's lost today.
yeah, and that's where we get controversial.
I don't mind controversy. That's
Yeah,
something I never shy away from. So
I
let's.
haven't shied away from it, but one of my daughters always says, "Don't attack their delusions." Well, I'm not really attacking anybody's delusion or their faith or their belief. We're out here in a very difficult world, and people join this church or this religion, and or this group because they're drowning, because they're trying to make sense out of the world, and it's hard to do alone. And so
Mhm.
you get into a group, and then hopefully you grow in that group. And if unfortunately, when you grow beyond the understanding of the group may turn on you,
Mhm.
and find another group. That's all I can say. But you have to be faithful to what God is telling you in your heart, and you have to act upon it. It's not enough to believe. The word that we see believe in the New Testament, pistos in the Greek, it meant you believe to the point where you cannot help but act upon what you think. It's not just an idea or ideology. It's
Mhm.
written into the very fabric of your being. So anyway, Abraham's out there in the desert. Actually, he was originally in Ur. Then he went to Haran with his father when his father left Haran because somebody executed his son, Haran. And so he went to a city and started it and named it after his son. But Abraham left that city too. And he went out to the desert and he built altars of stone. And we hear Moses building altars of clay and stone. And people have you thinking that the purpose of those altars of unhewn stone was to bring sheep, put them on the altar, and burn them up. That's the picture that we get from the Renaissance and from ideologies about interpretations of the Old Testament. in our book, Thy Kingdom Come. All our books are free online, but one of the second book is Thy Kingdom Comes, and in chapter 2 we talk about the sophistry. We have articles up at our websites that talk about the same thing, that we believe, or I believe, and I hope other people believe, I don't require anybody to believe me, is that those altars were systems of social welfare. The stones of the altar were living stones, just like they were called in the New Testament. And they were men that you trusted. Actually, the same word for a gathering of stones in the Hebrew is the same word for a gathering of friends. And so if you read it, this altar of stone is an altar of friends. They're unhewn because they're unregulated. But what regulates them? The people gather together, and eventually with Moses, we see them gathering together in the tens, hundreds, and thousands. They tithe to the minister of their choice, and he receives their offering, and he ministers to the congregations, the tabernacles of the congregation, which is the tents of the congregation. So the social bonds of Israel out there in the desert, facing Amalekites and Amalekites and just difficulties, desert living, everything else, they had to help one another. They did not have the social welfare system of Egypt that had brought them into bondage. I mean, they had gone into bondage in Egypt because they didn't have provisions. They didn't have provisions because the one guy that could have told them that a famine was coming, they sold into slavery, which was their brother,
Yeah.
Joseph. And Reuben even says, now we have to pay, we ran out of money, ran out of their livestock. They still need bread because the famine's going on 7 years. And the Pharaoh says, I will feed you now for free, but you have to promise to give me 1/5 of your labor from now on, 20% of your labor. And that was the bondage of Egypt, the beginning of it. It got worse later on, but it was still 20%. Actually, when I was a pretty young man, it was still 20% in Egypt under Mubarak. I don't know what it is today, but I thought that was, you make $1 million, 20% was your income tax.
Really?
Yeah.
Just flat fee under Mubarak?
Yeah, flat tax under Mubarak. I doubt they're doing that now, but I actually was in a position that I found that out way back then. But the point is that was the bondage of Egypt, and Reuben says they went into bondage because they would not hear the cries of their brother. When they said, this curse has come upon us because we wouldn't hear the cries of the brother. That's one of those universal principles. When Jesus, let's go back to Samuel, when they wanted to have a king. They didn't have a king for hundreds of years in Israel, but they had a nation that was bound together, that would show up at battles. People would look at them. They were all wealthy. You know, that their families stuck together for the most part. They were healthy. I mean, the average Canaanite lived to about 40, according to archaeologists, because they were ridden with parasites. Most of those parasites came from pork, and because they had no ivermectin in those days, so they had this terrible problem. Here comes the Jews. And they don't have these problems. They're not stooped over with parasites and dying and swollen bellies of their children. And they said, we want to be like them. But of course, the ruling factors in Canaan didn't want to lose their subjects. And so they fought against the Jews. But I think that according to archaeological records, they see pork bones everywhere when they dig down in the archaeology. That was one thing I was very fond of, is archaeology. They would dig down, they'd find pork bones disappeared at a particular point in the history in the Canaanite area. People just stopped growing pigs and raising pigs. There were hardly any found anywhere.
Is that because they found out that the pigs were causing parasites?
Well, they saw the Israelites coming
Not
in.
eating.
Everybody, with gilded swords and gold and silver in their pockets and free and camaraderie. You can go and, it's kind of like the old Magnificent Seven where Eli Wallach says, I learned one thing. I can rob Mexicans, but I cannot rob the Americans because they send a whole army after me. Well, that's what people learned, is that you couldn't rob an Israelite. You couldn't attack him or his family because they would all show up.
Yeah,
And
a
they
real
would
sense
show
of
up
community.
with swords. They had this, what Dr. Malone calls the social bonds of
Hmm.
society. And he says, Malone says, we live in a sick society where those social bonds have degenerated and that we need to reform those. Well, the way we reform them is what Moses was doing, what Abraham was doing, what Christ was doing, was setting up living altars where we no longer depended upon the state, Pharaoh, Nimrod. This is just repeated over and over again throughout the text for our social welfare. I mean, Proverb tells you, David tells you, and is quoted by Paul, there is a welfare that is a snare and a trap. Polybius, just a Greek philosopher and historian 150 years before Christ, is saying that when the people develop an appetite for benefits and accustomed to receiving them at the expense of others, they will degenerate. And
Hmm.
eventually he
Well, we're
says, and become one, they will degenerate into perfect savages, finding once more a monarch and a king.
we're really, really, really seeing the dependency on the state and the effects of it. We're seeing it to the point where the state almost demands a form of uh, kind of the same way that a religion demands a certain degree of faith. Now that the state is demanding that same religion, that same degree of faith from people.
Yes,
You have to almost idolize them, and you have to give up your rights. You have to give up your freedoms. You have to, whatever the state tells you. I really do believe that it's a and if you look, everything they're trying to do is destroy God. There's a competition between state and God because they can't control you if you believe in God. It's just too powerful a thing. So they have to take that away from you. The population that is mostly atheist, nihilist, doesn't believe in any type of absolute truth is a population that you can get to do terrible things because there's no consistent ethics in that population.
yeah, I think there's actually something mystical that takes place, something spiritual that takes place. And Jesus talks about it. He says, they sit in darkness,
Hmm.
and the blind lead the blind. I think we're seeing that same thing today, but how light do people want to get it? When in the Old Testament, when Adam and Eve fled the garden, they fled the garden after God supposedly put a cherub in the tree of life. And of course, these are symbols: tree of life, tree of knowledge. Tree of knowledge is you trying to decide what is good and evil based on your personal knowledge alone. But the tree of life is you're dependent upon a personal revelation, a spiritual revelation. And you have to believe that there's a spiritual realm in which you can receive this revelation.
Hmm.
Recently, there was a book, actually, a whole thing. We have an article up on it where they talk of mass formation of psychosis. Um,
I did
and
it. This is part of the documentary with Jordan Peterson. We call it mass psychosis, psychogenic epidemics.
yeah,
Uh,
and the guy who presented this he's from Denmark. He's saying that scientists today, more and more, the really top scientists, say that you can reason from the facts that you study in science to a point, but eventually, all sorts of scientists have come out with this. He chronicles them in his book, but he says they ultimately depend upon some sort of inspiration. Einstein even said this, that you have to have this connection to something greater than yourself, and you have to have the humility in order to do that, to really figure out what's going on in the world. Well, I'm because of my, I have some background in Greek and Latin and languages, and then Hebrew. We go through and we're showing you what were most Christians being persecuted for in Rome. We actually have the trial notes from ancient documents as to why they were complaining about Christians. Christians had private religion at one time in the Roman Constitution. Private religion was legal, and Jesus's religion again, 5 times is mentioned in the Bible, all in the New Testament. The word religion in the translation. Of course, they really talk about religion, but to understand what it is, it talks about a good thing one time It's how you take care of the needy of your society, the widows and orphans and needy of your society. And it says that it's only pure religion when it's unspotted by the world. Well, there's 5 different Greek words translated into world. So which one is that? It's the one that means constitutional order or system of government. Because your offering, your sacrifices in the Old Testament, it's always, Corban was a free will sacrifice. The individual chose to give to the minister of his choice. It's sometimes called a votive offering. And if he didn't do good with what you gave him, if he didn't really help the widows and orphans and needy of society, you didn't have to give to him next week. You gave to somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
But you had to give. You had to have this sacrifice for your fellow man, casting your bread upon the waters in hopes that it comes back to you. If your social welfare in your government, whatever country you're in, is not based on free will offerings, but on forced offerings, you're not going to be free for long.
That's the difference between dependency and interdependency. Interdependency is, and they both appear the same from the outside. If you were to look at it, at least in the beginning, if you were to look at a society that is creating dependency versus interdependency, they would almost look identical. You'd see the government taking money and redistributing it based on where they need to put it. But if you look at a truly interdependent society where it's coming from free will, they don't tend to decay. That is people making the choice to give because they want to give.
Right.
And they get to choose where they put it. And that's a truly free society. You can't have a society that's truly free based on dependency. If someone's forcing you to give, they are by definition forcing you. It is not freedom. It is the opposite of freedom to force somebody to do anything.
And it's also coveting your neighbor's goods if you desire the benefits at the expense of your neighbor, which is one of those fundamental principles we find in those 10 statements given to Moses, that we're not to covet our, because it's at the end doesn't make it less important any more than the 9th and 10th Amendment are less important, because the 9th and 10th Amendment, they're all equally important. And so back to that idea that you mentioned, faith and allegiance, those are synonymous terms if you look it up in a thesaurus. With religion, we say that we live by faith, hope, and charity. But do you really live by faith, hope, and charity if all your social welfare comes from men who exercise authority, who take away from your neighbor to provide you with free stuff? Or worse than that, they take away from your neighbor's children. They curse your neighbor's children with death. Peter says, through covetous practices, they shall make merchandise of you. This New Testament. And of course, like I was saying, David said the same thing. There's a welfare that is a trap and a snare. And Paul quotes David in the New Testament. The Old Testament and the New Testament are telling us exactly the same thing. But some people privately and misinterpreted the Old Testament so you don't see it. So I know that when I first started writing books, and I was led to do that, another long story, but I was out here in the desert. I couldn't figure out what I was looking out in the world. It's 75 miles to town, so we're out in the boonies. So the world could easily pass me by, and I wouldn't notice it. But I still, you interact with people, and you say, well, this is back in the Reagan era, and before Reagan even, and I could see that society, something's going wrong. Even earlier than that, I saw where people were getting raped in the streets, and people would shut their blinds. They would close their doors. They wouldn't come to their aid. That was unheard of in America.
Where was this happening?
Well, New York.
Los New York back in the day was terrible.
In Los Angeles, I had a guy who worked for me. I ran a restaurant, and a couple of them. Well, actually, Shakey's Pizza Parlor. I used to be a manager of a couple of those, and I was only 21 at the time, just barely old enough to serve beer. So anyway, but one of the guys who worked for me, he's going to the local college, and he was walking down the street, and he saw a woman being dragged in broad daylight, dragged along the sidewalk towards a car door that was open, and the car was running, and she's being dragged, and she's yelling and screaming, and he's looking at this as he's walking up, trying to make sense out of what he's seeing. And he's actually looking around. This is LA, so he's looking around for the TV cameras or movie cameras. Am I coming on a set? Is this, it doesn't seem real. And he walked up, the guy didn't see him, and he walked up behind the guy and tapped him on the shoulder and was going to ask him, what are you doing? What's going on here? And the guy looked at him and screamed like a girl almost. I mean, just a high-pitched scream. And let her go, jumped in the car, and drove away. Now, as he was walking up, he could see other people on this street. This is San Fernando Valley, real near the college. She was a student also. And he could see people in the apartments looking out their window and not doing anything. Nobody's doing anything. Of course, we didn't have cell phones in those days, but still, nobody called the police. Nobody intervened. She never even knew who that guy was. He just grabbed her and was kidnapping her in broad daylight and about to get her away with. The interesting thing about this story is she fell down around a friend of mine's legs, wrapped her arms around his legs. This is her knight in shining armor, just saved her. And she's just weeping. Can't even stand up. She's so weak from the ordeal. And then somebody opens up a window that he had watched as he walked up, trying to figure out maybe the cameras were up there. He couldn't figure it out. And anyway, the guy yells, what are you doing to that girl down there? The guy witnessed the whole thing. He knows he didn't do anything. He's still standing there not knowing what to do. But there's a disconnect.
Now he's trying to create some kind of value for himself because he knows he did nothing.
He's not afraid now. So now because he knows this guy's not a threat. But we've become a nation of cowards. We're no longer the home of the brave. And my contention is the reason why is 100 years of legal charity. I was trying to think. Alexis Tocqueville wrote a book, America, Democracy in America.
Mm-hmm.
And he talks about legal charity destroying America if they were to ever go that way. Of course, back there in 1850, we weren't doing that. But he saw it starting to raise its head in Europe because he was from France. And he was saying, he wrote, A Pauperism, another one of his books, saying that this legal charity will degenerate the soul of Americans if they allow this to happen. And he said what made us great was the fact that our schools, our hospitals, our even some prisons were built by charitable contributions of the people. We think that all those schools were built by the government. The government had nothing to do. Even the oldest school building in our own valley here, built in 1910, was built by the hands of the farmers and ranchers who put up the money to do it.
People do tend to give a lot more when they're not forced to give. If you look at like these, there's just on GoFundMe alone, all the people who are suffering from real serious conditions, there's a lot of people who just out of the goodness of their hearts want to give to those people. And so I do believe that if you allow people the platform to be good, if you're not taking away from them from being forced, then that money that was taken from them would be given anyway. I really do believe that. But there's some kind of weird thing happening in society now where number one, there's been an inversion of virtues. So you look at the things you're talking about, like courage. I've talked about this a lot, standing up in the face of danger and adversity and just being willing to speak up. Those are historically, and being strong, especially for men, both physically and in terms of, again, fortitude. Those are virtues that have kept every society in history stable. And those have been completely inverted. It's not just that we got rid of them. We're now placing like being safe, feeling safe for yourself as the highest. We really saw it during COVID that like your own safety, your personal, how you feel, you should rat out your neighbor, you should rat out everyone. And people are going to say, well, no, that was for the greater good, but it really wasn't.
Yeah, it's to justify themselves. You can go back to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. A lot of people want to know, what's the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah? And they ask that question in the Bible. And they tell you in the Bible that the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah was in a time of affluence, they did not strengthen the poor. It doesn't say they didn't help the poor. because this is one of the things we go behind the scenes, and that's where you first start seeing the man behind the curtain when you go behind the scenes. But the reality is that social welfare from Nimrod, who is in the Bible, they translated Nimrod was a mighty hunter before the Lord. The word hunter there is not translated hunter anywhere else in the Bible. Only there in that one verse. Normally it's victuals or food or meats or things that he was a mighty provider. Provisions, that's another word that it's translated into. Nimrod collected from the people through taxation and provided the welfare for the people. And this weakened the people, changed them, where now if you don't do that, I can show you in numerous, and we do. That's what all of our books, all of our articles, like I say, they're all free online, and all our audios. We're going through doing Bible studies on one chapter. We did one on Exodus during the time that Jordan Peterson was doing his study of Exodus. And of course, we pointed out all the things they missed. I thought they did a pretty good job in today's interpretation of the text. But even Jordan said, well, we can't answer, they couldn't come up with some of the answers. And I think one of the key things is if you don't understand that the social bonds of Israel were not created because we all burn up sheep together. It's because we have these altars of charity that depend upon our personal faith to one another and our faith to righteousness and our charity, our sacrifice for our neighbor that creates the bonds. When I first realized how important this was, I was actually on a wheat farm in North Dakota, and I was staying with my grandmother. She was blind at the time, and I noticed one day that the carton of milk, I was normally out on the farm, but I'd come in on the weekends and do chores for her, and I noticed the milk was pink, and I thought, well, geez, this shouldn't be pink. So I took it to the store and told the store, did you have any other milk that was pink? Well, she was blind, very thrifty, and I think she poured her tomato juice back into the milk. But I couldn't tell, and I wasn't going to taste it. But I wanted to know if other people are getting pink milk, then there's something bad with the shipment. So I went down to the little local store. This is a tiny little town. They know everybody. Grenora, North Dakota. And the guy wanted to give me milk. I says, oh, I can buy new milk. If she did something, I can buy new milk. But he said, no, I give it to you. I want to give you the milk. And he told me that when he was a little boy, the only one who came back and paid all their store bill up as almost a religious obligation was my grandfather, who I never met. He died before I was even born. But this was a generation later. He says, as long as there's food in my story, your grandmother will never go hungry. So this is passing down from generation to generation. And the Bible tells you in the Old Testament and the New Testament that the kingdom of God is from generation to generation. But the kingdom of God is simply those people who want to live by faith, hope, and charity. And when you start doing that, it will alter you. It will open new doors. It will take the scales off your eyes. You're just trying to do it. Because then you're going to come face to face with your own personal selfishness and like, yeah, I should do this, but but the reality is we have been slowly degenerating, according to Polybius, because we become more and more dependent upon the state, and Christ said this in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. You are not to be like the governments. He actually said governments, the princes of the Gentiles, who call themselves benefactors, providers of benefits, but exercise authority one over the other. It is not to be that way with you. And shortly after that in Luke, he appoints to the apostles a kingdom, and they're seen rightly dividing the bread from house to house. That's the social welfare. Where'd they get the bread? Free will offerings. Yeah. And like I said, Christians were persecuted because the left of its day, I don't want to pick on the left, but the reality, the socialists of the day, because what brought Rome down was the free bread and circuses. That, I mean, in their own documents, we quote the people of the time that said this was what was destroying, ruining Rome. Quite a few different sources say that. But Christians were doing something different, and this made the people who were dependent upon government feel guilty. So they hated the Christians. And then, about 100 years after Christ, they outlawed private religion in parts of the Roman Empire. And Christians were arrested and told that you had to swear by the genius of Caesar. Yeah, another article we have, just real quick,
Yep.
is Jesus was called the Son of God. Most people don't know historically Caesar was called the Son of God. This is what
Really?
made Pontius Pilate nervous when they said, he says he's the Son of God. All Romans knew every year you had to go in to the temple, which is where you got your social welfare, and burn incense, which you bought from the priest, and swear that Caesar was the Son of God. Because he was the head of the religious institutions of the Roman temples. All the temples, this was a big question when I was in the seminary. What were they doing in those temples? Those were just government buildings. Temple of Moneta, minted coin. The Temple of Saturn, that's where you put your birth certificate. And if you were from another country, that's where ambassadors registered at that temple. If you had contracts, they had a tabularium where you'd put your contract there. They'd be written on clay tablets. And then when you fulfilled the contract, they'd break the tablet. That's what they talk about, breaking the contract, because it was actually a
Oh,
clay
that makes
tablet.
sense. Yeah.
And but this was their government. I mean, Ephesus, the temple at Ephesus, which was persecuting poor Paul, it was built by 127 different countries because it was the insurance underwriter for the social welfare systems of Rome, Corinth, Galatia, many of these other city-states. Jesus had, but when they got to Ephesus, they said there is another king, one Jesus, that wasn't a member of the temple at Ephesus, which was the World Bank. It had the strongest vault in all of the Mediterranean. And if you don't know the history, I mean, they minted coin there as well. And we go into that in a lot more detail than I'll do on this show. But anyway, understanding these bits and pieces of history, the environment in which the Gospels were spoken, what the conflict, the Christian conflict was, suddenly can put a lot of Christian denominations in a bad light, because 90% or better of most of the social welfare in these churches today is through those men who exercise authority one over the other. And I'm not faulting people for it. I'm just speaking the truth. And it's causing a degeneration of our thinking. It's changing our minds. Repentance is changing our minds back to what it should be. That's what the word that we translate into repentance. It's not about being sorry, although you might be sorry. It's about changing of the mind, thinking a different way. And so, I know, like I say, people aren't going to accept everything that I have to say. It's going to seem so different. It's going to, like I say, we serve meat here. I guess that's why I'm a herdsman. And meat sometimes takes some chewing. And so we let people go away and think
Well,
about it. But we give them lots of footnotes so they can check it out themselves. We don't want anybody just to believe us.
well, I think it's good that you're out there doing the best you can at a minimum. You know what I mean? So I think that society needs people to guide us back to the right path, and I think there's something amiss. I would not be the person to figure out exactly how to fix it, but I do know that faith is probably the best way forward. So 100% on that. So we've gone 40 minutes. Normally I cut it off around here. Is there anything you want to promote or tell people where to find you? And I'll put it in the description as well.
Okay, well, our main website is hisholychurch.org. We started that an awful long time ago, and it's got it has all the books on it, so you can download them. There's a search engine on the page. We also have preparingyou.com, which is most of my more recent articles. You can find us in podcasts with Keys to the Kingdom with Brother Gregory, and we're just hoping that people will start to open up their eyes and turn what they begin to see into action, because Jesus himself says it's not what you say. You can tell me you believe in Jesus. You can tell me you believe in Moses and Abraham, but Jesus says it's what you do. It's not those who say, but those who do the will of the Father. And the will of the Father is that you love one another and don't divide one another into denominations and ideologies. We have to learn how to take care of one another, and I think that's what made America great. A lot of stuff going on in politics. I'm kind of apolitical. I'm not against anybody. I'm for what, if we don't change, before governments will change, men must change.
Yep.
And if no one man is your salvation, you
I
you
agree with
have
that
to
too.
alter. You have to change, and the way in which we come together has to be based on that faith, hope, and charity, that love. So anyway, also we're creating a network at Preparing You. You can go there and click on the network links. We think people need to get in touch with people locally, and so if it's based on geography. You join a group in Texas, and you're connected with people in Texas that are on the group. And the more people that do that, you can find people locally, because what's coming. Uh, I can't help you with, but God
Yeah,
can help
that's
you
the
with it.
scary thing.
And you have to be caring about your neighbor as much as you care about yourself. Well, you can't do that unless you know your neighbor. And this is so different. A lot of your neighbors aren't going to accept it. So anyway, so those are the websites. They can get a hold of us. We put out newsletters every week. We put out audios. I do 5 or 6 hours a week in audios, going through the Bible, going through these things, and we answer questions. Every book was the result of somebody asking questions. So we may have already answered the questions that are coming in people's minds. So that they're on the website. I
Okay,
want to
fantastic.
also thank you for inviting to do this interview too. So
No, I'm very happy to do it, and I learned a lot, so it was fantastic for me as well, selfishly.
that's okay. We're mutually selfish sometimes.
Thanks very much.
God bless.